Period 1 begins with the Age of Discovery, and more specifically, Columbus's discovery of the New World. Now, Columbus's discovery of the New World would begin a merging of two very distinct cultures, the cultures of European nations and the cultures of the native populations in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this merging of cultures would have a significant impact on the development both of the European nations and the native populations in this Western Hemisphere. In the end, this contact of European nations and the native populations would have a devastating impact on those native civilizations in the New World, because those native civilizations failed to adequately respond to a superior military force and substantial changes brought on in their environment. Now, these native populations in the Western Hemisphere had developed complex societies, and these societies had evolved distinct cultural differences. And these differences were amplified because as the populations migrated, they had to adapt to the geographic requirements to where they settled. Looking specifically at the native populations in the present-day United States, each had their unique cultural characteristics, and these cultural characteristics were largely defined by the geography in which they lived. For example, the Pueblo, or the Anasazi, migrated north from Mexico, carrying the knowledge of maize cultivation as their staple crop, and they settled in the arid Southwest. Whereas the native populations in the Great Plains found a different environment and adapted a nomadic lifestyle so that they could hunt and pursue their main source of sustenance, which is the American bison. In the eastern and northwestern regions, native populations found much more plentiful resources so they could establish more permanent villages. Early migration by native populations required adaptation to the specific geographic environmental factors they would encounter. And these adaptations led and evolved into very unique and distinct cultures of native populations throughout the present-day United States. Now let's look across the ocean to the Age of Discovery in Europe. The 15th century in Europe was marked by a consolidation of power by European nations. These nations, such as Spain and France and Britain, combined small feudal kingdoms into one nation. As these nations formed, they began to invest in trade with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And as competition for trade routes increased, so did the investment in new naval technologies to help the countries like France and Britain and Spain establish their own proprietary trade routes with these countries. And the Age of Discovery was fueled and cultivated by these new naval technologies and this desire to establish proprietary trade routes. Additionally, these European nations began to buy into the economic idea of mercantilism, which in very basic terms states that a country's power is directly correlated to its gold. So the more gold a country has, the bigger military it can fund, and the more power it will secure among other nations. As these European nations grew, so did the competition between them. The economic competition of acquiring more gold than any other country, and the religious competition of spreading their religion, and this competition encouraged even more exploration, which would ultimately bring the European nations into contact with the native populations in the Western Hemisphere. Now, these European nations quickly established dominance over the native populations for two reasons. The first is the spread of European diseases like smallpox and measles, which the native populations had no natural immunities to. And the second was a superior military force and technology of the European explorers. For an example of how quickly these native populations were decimated, within just 100 years of the explorer De Soto finding a thriving Mississippi culture in the American heartland, it had all but disappeared. Now, different European countries had different strategies for colonizing the New World. Some, like the Spanish, use a mixture of forced native and African slave labor to advance their agricultural interest as well as their mining interest, which resulted in Spain shipping literally boatloads of gold across the Atlantic back to Spain. To help in colonizing the New World, the Spanish also implemented the encomienda system, which rewarded conquistadors with the labor of the populations that they conquered. Now, it wasn't long until the conquistadors ran these native populations into the ground, either through disease or malnourishment or overwork, and they had to bring in African slave labor to continue their agricultural and mining interests. Now, other European nations, like the French and the Dutch, utilized commerce and trade as a means to advance their economic interests in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this strategy relies on cooperation with the native populations and not the forced subjugation of them. Agricultural colonies, like the ones the English established, significantly encroached on native lands. The English, to secure agricultural lands, would have to displace the native populations currently on the land so that they secure it. Now, this would radically alter the natural environment and lead to great military conflict with the native populations. While European incursions into the Western Hemisphere required adjustments on both sides, the bulk of adjustments clearly fell upon the native populations. All this contact resulted in the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange simply refers to the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between civilizations in the Western Hemisphere and civilizations in the Eastern Hemisphere, so specifically Europe, Asia, and Africa. The technological innovations exchanged significantly enhanced both cultures, as well as the livestock and the crops exchange significantly altered the diets both of the Europeans, Africans, and Asians, as well as those in the Western Hemisphere. Now, on one hand, the Columbian Exchange spread devastating diseases throughout the Western Hemisphere and significantly altered its diets. But on the other hand, the new technologies introduced significantly improved and altered the lives of the native populations as well. For example, the introduction of firearms and horses led the Great Plains Indians to adopt a much more efficient nomadic lifestyle. At the same time, some of the crops from the Western Hemisphere introduced into the Europe and African nations significantly enhanced food production, which led to a population boom and a lack of chronic famine throughout the two continents. Western Hemisphere transplant foods like the potato quickly became staple crops throughout Europe, and the vast farmland available in the Western Hemisphere, specifically in the United States, allowed for an increase in wheat production on a global scale. As well, the abundance of natural resources throughout the Western Hemisphere significantly increased trade not only between Europe and the Western Hemisphere, but within Europe itself. While the Columbian Exchange had benefits to both the European and Western Hemisphere populations, the benefits to the Europeans far outweighed the benefits of the Western populations as they were devastated by European diseases. Ultimately, the thirst of Europeans to exploit the natural resources in the Western Hemisphere significantly threatened the native populations and upended their social structures and economies. As Europeans increased their demand for land, natural resources, and mineral wealth in the New World, they left the native populations with only one choice: submit or be exterminated. And the native population's attempt at armed resistance generally failed because they were either decimated by disease or the Europeans just had significantly more firepower. Overall, Period 1 looks at European contact with the Western Hemisphere and how this contact set the stage for the development of the United States.